Good evening, visitors. Welcome to the Australian War Memorial's Last Post ceremony, which today commemorates the 51st anniversary of the Battle of Long Tan and Vietnam Veterans Day. My name's Richard Cruz, and joining us today from the Australian Army is Major General Stuart Smith. General Smith will shortly retire from the Australian Army after 36 years of dedicated service. General Smith graduated from the Royal Military College Duntroon in 1984. He served with the United Nations as a military observer in Lebanon and Syria in 1993. General Smith was appointed Commanding Officer of the 1st Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment in December 2001 and led the battalion on peacekeeping duties in Timor-Leste in 2003. For his exceptional service on this deployment, he was appointed a member of the Order of Australia in 2005. General Smith conducted humanitarian assistance and disaster relief operations as the Chief of Staff of Australian Joint Task Force 629, following the earthquake and subsequent tsunami in Indonesia in 2004. He commanded the 3rd Brigade in Townsville during the period 2009 through to 2011 and coordinated the Australian Defence Force disaster response to Tropical Cyclone Yasi in North Queensland in February 2011. In 2012, General Smith was appointed Commander, Joint Task Force 633, responsible for Operation Slipper and Australian forces operating in the Middle East. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross in 2013 in recognition of his distinguished command and leadership in warlike operations while in this command. Following his return from the Middle East, General Smith assumed command of the 1st Division in October 2012. He led the division for 3 years and was advanced to Officer of the Order of Australia before handing over command to Major General Paul McLaughlin in November 2015. With over 36 years of dedicated service, General Smith will transition from the regular army to the Standby Reserve on the 1st of September 2017, having served as Deputy Commander, Joint Operations Command from 18 November 2015 to 17 May 2017. General Smith, we thank you for your service to the nation. Shortly, General Smith will tell the story of his father, Sergeant Bernard Lyle Smith. Sergeant Smith was serving in the 5th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, when he was killed in a mine incident on the 9th of March 1969, while on a night patrol during Operation Quintus Thrust. We warmly welcome the family of Sergeant Bernard Lyle Smith. We're also honoured to acknowledge Lieutenant General Angus Campbell, Chief of Army Australia, and Warrant Officer of the Army, Don Spinks. Mr John King, President, ACT Branch, Returned and Services League of Australia. And Mr Alex McGowan, ACT President of the Naval Association of Australia. Mr Tony Ralph, President of Legacy Australia. Ms Tracy Pulowski, Director of the National Army Museum, New Zealand, accompanied by Lieutenant Colonel Matt Beattie, retired. And we also welcome members of the 5th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment Association, and the many Vietnam veterans, and we thank you for your service. We further extend the welcome to all veterans who have served, those that are still serving, and the families that support them. We acknowledge the members of RSL and Services Clubs Association, RSL Victoria and RSL Queensland, who are watching the broadcast of this ceremony around Australia. During this evening's ceremony, wreaths will be laid at the base of the Pool of Reflection by family and visitors to the memorial. Could I ask you to please stand and join in singing the National Anthem?
Oh, let us rejoice, for we are young
I would now like to invite Dr. Brendan Nelson, Director of the Australian War Memorial, to deliver this evening's address.
The Vietnam War inflicted deep wounds on many of the 61,000 young Australians who served in it over more than a decade. Our nation emerged divided, yet determined to learn from the experiences of those who went in our name and our responses to them. The extraordinary heroism of 4 men awarded the Victoria Cross, epic battles at Long Tan, Coral, Balmoral, Bribie, Hammersley, and theatres across land, sea and air were often relegated in public consciousness behind increasing and strident opposition to the war itself. 521 young Australians gave their lives for us, and many returned bearing physical wounds and psychological traumas denied healing, shunned by sections of Australian society as reminders of war that they opposed and the conscription of young men to support it. We cannot rewrite history, nor can we be held hostage to it, but we can learn from it, and we have. Today, more than half a century on, we honour the tenacious courage and sacrifice of those young men of Delta Company, of the 6th Battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment, with the crucial fire support of 1st Field Regiment Royal Australian Artillery and New Zealand's 161 Field Battery and desperately needed RAAF helicopter resupply. They held their ground until Australian armoured personnel carriers arrived at nightfall. An isolated infantry company of 108 men, including 3 New Zealanders cut off and outnumbered by at least 10 to 1, withstood massed Viet Cong attacks for 3 hours. They suffered the heaviest Australian casualties in a single engagement in Vietnam, but prevailed against the odds. Their valiant stand in driving monsoonal rain became a defining action of the Vietnam War. At its end were 17 Australian dead. Another would die of his wounds. In 1987, Brigadier Colin Khan, who is here this evening, the former commanding officer of 5 RAR in Vietnam, delivered the dawn service address in Sydney. He spoke to the soldiers' experience of the Vietnam War. I saw the man who walked out front, the infantryman, so many of whom are the men we honour today. I saw a rain and sweat-drenched man in green, laden like a pack mule, aged 21, going on 50, cutting his way through jungle by day to find and attack the enemy, then laying all night in paddy fields or on trails in an ambush. Although this is the anniversary of one battle, on this day we honour and remember them all. Those young Australian men and women who served, fought, suffered and died during the Vietnam War, in our uniform, in our name, under our flag, for our values. Shortly we will hear of the life, service, courage and death of just one of them, one Australian who was loved and loved. His life and sacrifice is a reminder of how much our nation owes every one of the 102,700 men and women named on the Roll of Honour cloaking us here.
Thank you, Dr. Nelson. The Australian War Memorial was the vision of Charles Bean, Australia's First World War official historian. Been landed with the Australian troops on Gallipoli and stayed with them at the front through to the end of the war. The idea of this National Memorial and Museum came to him at Pozières, France, in the depths of the bloody fighting of 1916. Bean's idea was that this would be a place where families and friends could mourn loved ones buried in faraway places. It would also be a place that could help all Australians understand what these men and women had endured and what they had done for us. Bean's vision, to which we remain true, is best expressed as inscribed in the entrance to the memorial's galleries. Here is their spirit, in the heart of the land they loved, and here we guard the record which they themselves made. Tonight we'll read the story behind just one of those on the Roll of Honour, which lists the names of more than 102,000 men and women who have given their lives for us in war and operations over more than a century. But first we present a lament, Flowers of the Forest. Wreaths and floral tributes will now be laid at the base of the pool of reflection.
Today, we remember and pay tribute to Sergeant Bernard Lyle Smith. Bernard Smith was born on the 2nd of September 1939 at Snowtown in South Australia, the son of Edward Lyle and Mary Eileen Smith. Bernard attended Wallaroo Primary School and then Kadina High School before moving to Adelaide and studying at Sacred Heart College. Bernie, as he became known, enjoyed football and tennis and became a talented musician. Having learnt the piano from childhood, he developed the ability to play music by ear. He also played tenor horn with several community brass bands and a local group. At the age of 14, he applied to join the Australian Army as a band boy, but was unsuccessful. The following year, he left school and joined the South Australian Railways, where he worked as an assistant shunter and porter for almost 4 years, apparently biding his time until he was old enough to begin a military career. He had some inspiring role models in his family. His father had served as a radio operator in the Australian Army in the Second World War. His grandfather had served in South Africa during the Boer War, and 3 great uncles had served in the Australian Imperial Force in the First World War, one killed in action near Gurdakhor, and another dying from wounds suffered at Le Cateau. In November 1958, just 2 months after turning 19, Bernard Smith enlisted in the Australian Regular Army with the written consent of his father and elected to serve in the infantry. After recruit training, he was posted to a battalion, serving in Malaya from 1959 to November 1961. In April 1962, not long after returning to Australia, he married Janice Leonora Bain. Together, the couple settled in Sydney, and Smith continued to develop his military skills, attending army schools and instructional training courses. In March 1965, he joined the 5th Battalion, the Royal Australian Regiment, 5 RAR, a newly raised battalion being prepared for service in Vietnam. This was the first battalion to be made up equally of conscripted men and regular soldiers. Bernard was soon promoted to corporal and, at the age of 26, was training the first intake of 20-year-old national servicemen to march into 5 RAR's base at Holsworthy. The battalion arrived in Vietnam in May 1966. Soldiers laboured to establish a task force base at Nui Dat and conducted operations to extend control over Viet Cong-dominated territory. Constant patrolling soon became a staple of the Australian infantryman's experience in Vietnam. Corporal Bernard Smith was chosen to join the reconnaissance platoon, a specially formed team of selected and trained volunteers who carried out reconnaissance ahead of battalion movements and laid ambushes. Their work was effective in eliminating the Viet Cong, but it was demanding. 5 RAR's intelligence officer, Captain Robert O'Neill, recalled that they were lucky to have 1 night a month in base at Nui Dat. When 5 RAR's tour of duty ended in May 1967, the battalion returned to Sydney and marched through the city to a tumultuous welcome from a cheering crowd. It had been an exhausting year, with the pressure of continuous operations and the ever-present dangers of casualties from enemy ambushes and mines. The infantrymen of 5 RAR had each walked an average of over 1,100 kilometres on patrol. For Bernard and his comrades of the reconnaissance platoon, the burden had been even greater. In August 1967, Bernard was promoted to sergeant and posted to the officer training unit at Skyville, New South Wales, where he worked as an instructor, training young national servicemen selected as platoon commanders. The following year, on the 30th of August 1968, he was posted to his former unit, 5 RAR, which was reforming and preparing for its second tour of duty to Vietnam. As an experienced senior NCO with operational experience in Vietnam, he was a valuable asset to the battalion. Commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Colin Khan, recalled that the strength of the battalion was a hard core of outstanding regular sergeants and warrant officers, especially in the early days, before his officers gained equivalent battle experience. On the 15th of February 1969, after 12 months intensive training in Australia, 5RAR arrived in Vietnam. Sergeant Bernard Smith had arrived a week earlier with the unit's advance party. After 2 weeks acclimatisation, the battalion commenced its shakedown operation on the 1st of March, a reconnaissance in force in the Nui Din foothills west of the task force base at Nui Dat. The operation finished on the night of the 8th of March with a cordon search of the northern hamlets of the village of Wa Long, a kilometre south of the Nui Dat base. D Company moved into position in the cordon shortly after 1 a.m. Under a half moon, the young officer commanding 10 Platoon cut through a fence around a South Vietnamese Territorial Force outpost, which was known to be surrounded by a minefield. Followed by his troops, he entered the minefield and cut his way through another fence and then a third. When the party heard the click of a rifle bolt or safety catch, the platoon commander dropped to his knees and fired his rifle towards the post. The occupants retaliated with automatic fire and grenades, and the officer and 2 others were hit. A firefight erupted, with the Australians responding with rifle and machine gun fire. By the time the firing stopped, the platoon commander was dead and 3 others were wounded. Platoon Sergeant Bernard Smith came forward to take over. Along with a section commander and a scout, he bravely mounted a rescue mission into the minefield. Shortly afterwards, one of the senior NCOs accidentally activated a tripwire, detonating 1 or perhaps 2 M16 mines. Bernard Smith and another soldier were killed instantly, and 4 were wounded. Over the next 4 hours, soldiers struggled in the dark to extract stranded and wounded men from the minefield. 7 soldiers were wounded in the incident and 3 died. Second Lieutenant Brian Walker, Sergeant Bernard Smith and Corporal George Gilbert all left behind wives and young children in Australia. They were the first fatal casualties of the battalion's tour. Sadly, they were not to be the last. Bernard Smith was 29 years of age. He was survived by his younger sister Sondra, his young wife Janice, and his 2 infant boys, Stuart, aged 5, and Edward, who was 15 months old. Bernard's remains were returned home to Australia, and he was buried at Wallaroo Cemetery in South Australia. His name is listed on the Roll of Honour on my left, among more than 500 Australians who died in or as a result of Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War. This is but one of the many stories of service and sacrifice told here at the Australian War Memorial. We now remember Sergeant Bernard Lyle Smith, who gave his life for us, for our freedoms, and in the hope of a better world.
Please stand for the reading of the Ode and the sounding of the last post.
They shall grow not old as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them.
We will remember them.
lest we forget.
Lest we forget. We leave you this evening with the words of the memorial's founder, Charles Bean. Many a man lying out there at Pozières or in the low scrub at Gallipoli with his poor, tired senses barely working through the fever of his brain has thought in his last moments, well, it's over. But in Australia, they will be proud of this. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes the last post ceremony. We thank you for visiting the Australian War Memorial and wish you all a very good evening. Thank you.